Have you ever believed that a single cup of water could save an entire peace treaty? Out here in the dust-choked Badlands of 1847, mercy wasn't just rare, it was dangerous. And when a white rancher found a dying Apache warrior on his land, he made a choice that would change not just their lives, but the fate of an entire territory. This is a true story ripped from the brutal heart of the American frontier. In today's video, you'll discover how one act of human kindness ignited a political storm, why choosing compassion over fear could cost you your life in the Wild West, and what really happens when the law becomes the villain and a so-called enemy becomes the hero. Before we dive in, ask yourself, if you lived in a land where trust could get you killed, would you risk everything to save a stranger? What would you do if the blood on your land wasn't from an animal, but from a man everyone told you to hate? This is the story of Tobias Hartwell, a simple man, a rancher, and by all accounts, no hero. But on one fateful afternoon, he looked into the eyes of a wounded warrior and saw something no one else had dared to see: humanity. And it all started with a trail of blood that led straight to his well. The sun had barely crested the ridge when Tobias Hartwell noticed something off in the dirt. It wasn't the usual mess of coyote tracks or broken sagebrush. No, this was different. A trail of deep red drops already darkening in the morning dust, leading away from his eastern fence line, straight toward his well. Tobias stepped down from his porch slowly, rifle slung over one shoulder, every nerve alert. He'd seen blood before, plenty of it. Dead calves in winter, a wounded mule that had limped home half-eaten. Out here you learned the language of blood early. And this wasn't the blood of livestock. He knelt, ran 2 fingers through the nearest splatter and stared. It was fresh, thick, too red, too human. Tobias wasn't a skittish man. You didn't survive 12 years on a god-forsaken stretch of land like this if you jumped at every rustle. But there's something that grows in a man after years in the wild, a kind of sixth sense honed not by fear, but by experience. And right now, every bit of that experience was screaming, "This isn't right. Someone's bleeding out on your land." He followed the trail slow and steady, heart thudding in his chest like a warning drum. The drops grew closer together, heavier. And then they disappeared around the corner of the barn. He raised his rifle. Tobias rounded the barn and froze. There, slumped against the rough stone wall of his well, was a man. Not just any man, a young Apache, bare-chested and bleeding heavily from a wound just below the ribs. One hand pressed hard against the gash. The other reached upward, fingers trembling toward the wooden water bucket that hung just 3 feet above his head. The man's lips were cracked, eyes wild with pain and thirst. But even in agony, he watched Tobias with the clarity of someone who knew death could arrive from any direction. Now listen, this was 1847. Finding an Indian on your land was like finding a lit match in a dry barn. People didn't ask questions. They raised rifles and made sure the threat never stood up again. Every neighbor within 50 miles would have said the same thing: put a bullet in him before his friends show up. And truth be told, Tobias's finger hovered over the trigger. The smart thing, the safe thing, would have been to do just that. But then he saw something in the man's eyes. Not hate, not defiance, but desperation. Raw, human desperation. The kind Tobias had only known once before, during the drought of '44, when he'd gone 3 days without water and felt his tongue swell so large he couldn't swallow. The Indian tried to speak, but all that came out was a rasp. Water. And in that moment, everything changed. Tobias lowered the rifle. He unhooked the bucket, dipped it deep into the well, and brought it to the man's lips. The warrior drank like he'd been reborn, like each swallow pulled him back from the brink of death. Now here's the thing. Tobias Hartwell wasn't some preacher. He wasn't educated. He wasn't even particularly kind. But out here, when the world stripped you down to your bones, you learned what mattered. And sometimes what mattered most was just giving water to a dying man. That morning, by choosing mercy instead of fear, Tobias unknowingly stepped into the center of a conspiracy bigger than any war he'd ever imagined. But all he knew then was this: this man is hurt, and he needs help. What kind of man would I be if I walked away? But of course, mercy doesn't go unnoticed. And in the Wild West, no good deed comes without consequence. Because just as the color began to return to the warrior's face, Tobias saw something that made his blood run cold. The wound in the man's side wasn't from a fall or a wild animal. It was a bullet wound, fresh and close range. And somewhere out there in the still morning air, the ones who fired that bullet were riding straight toward Tobias's land. Tobias had seen bullet wounds before. He knew the look of torn flesh, the stink of burned powder, and the way blood pulses when the shot hits something vital. But this wasn't some clean shot from far off in the hills. The angle the powder burns. This man had been shot at close range, on purpose. And that meant one terrifying thing. Someone out there wanted him dead, badly, and they might be following the trail of blood that now ended at Tobias's well. Tobias glanced back at the barn, the hills beyond, and the stretch of land he'd fought so hard to call his own. His stomach twisted with unease. By giving this man water, he hadn't just saved a life. He may have painted a target on his own front door. The warrior, barely able to move, looked up at Tobias and raised a trembling hand. Then slowly, he pointed toward the horizon and drew his thumb across his throat. The message was clear. They're coming, and they don't plan on asking questions. Now here's the truth. They don't write in history books. Life out west wasn't just about shooting straight or building fences. It was about decisions. Decisions that didn't come with time to think or a second chance to get them right. And here Tobias stood looking down at a stranger bleeding out in his dirt, knowing full well that if the riders caught wind of this man on his property, they wouldn't ask for explanations. They'd burn his barn, hang him from his own tree, and call it justice. It wasn't just a risk. It was suicide. He could walk away now. Pretend he saw nothing. Let nature take its course. No one would blame him. Hell, his neighbors would pat him on the back for staying alive. But he didn't walk away. Instead, Tobias looked the warrior in the eyes, those dark eyes still swimming with pain, and said, "I ain't leaving you here, friend." With effort, he slipped an arm under the man's shoulder, wincing as the warrior groaned in pain. He wasn't strong enough to carry him not far. But just maybe, he could get him to the old root cellar behind the barn, hide him, buy them some time. As they moved, the man's blood left a fresh trail on the dirt. Tobias grabbed the empty bucket and began splashing water over it, trying to mask the evidence. He worked fast, but not fast enough, because that's when he heard it. Hoofbeats, far off but growing louder. Multiple horses moving fast. It wasn't just fear Tobias felt. It was certainty. Whoever shot this man, they were almost here. The warrior heard it too. His eyes widened, breath ragged. And then something shifted in his face. Not panic, not despair, something quieter, almost like acceptance. He grabbed Tobias's wrist with surprising strength and shook his head, as if to say, "Don't risk yourself for me. It's too late." And then he smiled. Not a smile of gratitude, but a knowing smile, as if he knew exactly who was coming over that hill and exactly what would happen next. Tobias realized something in that moment. Sometimes the hardest part of doing the right thing is knowing it won't protect you. It won't reward you. It won't even guarantee survival. But you do it anyway. Because being a man in the West wasn't about how many acres you owned. It was about who you were when no one was watching. And just as Tobias moved to shield the wounded man behind the well, they arrived. 6 riders storming over the ridge like thunder, dust in the air, rifles on their backs, and leading them, a man Tobias recognized the moment he saw those cold, pale eyes, Marshal Dixon Webb. The kind of lawman who didn't believe in second chances, the kind who shot first and left the questions for someone else to answer, the kind who could end both their lives in a heartbeat, all while calling it justice. Marshal Dixon Webb pulled up his horse just 10 feet from the well. The dust hadn't even settled before his icy blue eyes locked onto Tobias. That stare, it was the kind that stripped the skin off a man's soul. No anger, no warmth, just cold calculation. Like a man who'd already decided who was guilty and was just waiting for an excuse to draw. Behind him, 5 other riders fanned out in a semicircle, hands resting on holsters. No one spoke, because they weren't here for conversation. They were here for blood. Now you can learn a lot about a man by the way he holds a stare. A scared man will blink too fast. A liar will look away. And a killer doesn't blink at all. Webb was that kind of man. The kind who thought fear was just another form of obedience. Tobias met his stare doing his best to play it cool. He was just a rancher tending to a busted well, not hiding a bleeding man 2 feet behind him. But the sweat on his brow told another story. Afternoon, Hartwell Webb said, voice smooth as a rattlesnake's hiss. We're tracking a wounded Apache. Blood trail leads right to your property. Tobias tried to keep his voice steady. Ain't seen no one? Been fixing the south fence all morning. Webb's eyes drifted to the dirt where water-darkened soil barely covered the red stains. His lips curled. That is so. Because unless you've been slaughtering cattle beside your drinking water, that sure looks like blood. Behind the stone well wall, the Apache warrior lay perfectly still. But Tobias could feel his presence like a heartbeat under his boots. One twitch, one groan, and it would be over. For both of them. Webb dismounted slowly, each step deliberate. His hand settled on the butt of his pistol, not drawn yet. You know what the penalty is for harboring an Indian fugitive, don't you, Hartwell? Same as treason, rope around the neck till dead. There it was. No pretense anymore. Tobias's throat tightened. His knees wanted to bend, his heart hammered like a war drum. But he stood his ground. Because sometimes all a good man has is the ground beneath his feet, and the choice to either hold it or run. And then, something no one expected happened. From behind the well, a voice rang out, not weak or breathless like before, but clear, measured, and not in English. The Apache warrior. Ayanna spoke in his native tongue. The words flowed like music, soft, rhythmic, powerful. Webb froze. His body tensed mid-step. His eyes widened. And then he paled, like he'd just seen a ghost wearing the face of the man he tried to kill. The other riders looked at one another confused. One by one they dismounted, their weapons forgotten, their expressions fear. But not the kind aimed at an enemy. No, this was different. This was the fear of realizing you may have just tried to kill the wrong man. Ayanna spoke again, this time in perfect English. Tell him, Marshal. Tell him why you really rode so hard to find me. Webb didn't answer, so Ayanna did it for him. I am Ayanna, son of Chief Takakota. I am the one who brokered peace between our people and Fort Richardson. And just like that, Tobias felt the ground shift beneath him. Because he hadn't just offered water to a wounded stranger. He'd just saved the only man standing between this territory and another war. There's something dangerous about assumptions, especially out here. People die over what they think they know. Tobias had been raised like most white men of the West to see the Apache as enemies. But looking into Ayanna's face now, into eyes full of calm, quiet authority, he saw something he didn't expect. Not rage, not pride, but disappointment. The kind a teacher might wear when a student fails a lesson they should have passed long ago. We fear what we refuse to understand, Tobias would later say. And sometimes, all it takes is a second look to realize we've been wrong all along. But this story wasn't over. Because Marshal Webb didn't come here to shake hands or offer apologies. He came here to finish a job. And now the man he'd tried to silence was standing and talking, and about to reveal something that would turn the whole West upside down. Long before you see trouble on the frontier, you hear it. The low, thunderous rhythm of hooves striking dry earth like distant drums beating out a warning across the plains. Not one horse, many, and not at a trot. They were galloping, hard, fast, coming straight for the ranch. Tobias Hartwell heard them, just as Ayanna slumped back against the well stone, his body trembling from the effort of standing. It was a sound Tobias knew too well. He had heard it before when Comanche raiders charged a homestead 5 miles south. He'd heard it when a posse came to hang a cattle thief. And now, He was hearing it for himself. In the Wild West, danger speaks in many tongues. A rattlesnake's hiss, the dry click of an empty chamber, and most clearly of all, the rhythm of approaching hooves. You don't need to see the riders to know what kind they are. The pace, the weight, the urgency. Friendly riders don't come that fast. Not with rifles strapped to their saddles, not when the trail they're following is painted in blood. Tobias looked down at Ayanna. He was still bleeding, still pale, but alert, now his eyes locked on the horizon. Tobias's mind raced. Maybe they could hide him, get him to the root cellar behind the barn, throw a tarp over the entrance, buy a few minutes, maybe more. But as he knelt to help, Ayanna reached out again, gripped Tobias's wrist, shook his head. No, the look said. Don't run, don't hide, it's too late. And then, Ayanna did something that made Tobias's blood run cold. He smiled. Not a smile of relief, not even a thank you. It was the smile of a man who knew what was coming and wasn't afraid. Tobias stood up slowly, turning toward the sound. The hoofbeats grew louder, close enough now to feel beneath his boots. And then they appeared. 6 riders cresting the ridge like a storm rolling in. Dust curled around them. Sunlight caught on polished rifles. And at the front, just like before Marshal Dixon Webb, his expression carved from stone. The men rode in hard, forming a semicircle again, weapons within easy reach. They didn't look around this time. They looked straight at Tobias. They knew. Now, here's something folks rarely talk about. There's always a moment, just a breath, between the arrival of danger and the first move. A single fragile space where you can decide who you are and what kind of story this becomes. Tobias felt that moment settle on his shoulders like a weight. He could lie, say nothing, step aside, let the law handle things, and wash his hands clean. But then, he looked back at Ayanna, and those eyes, the ones that had once been clouded with pain, now looked back with something else entirely. Trust, not the kind you ask for. The kind that's given when a man has nothing left to lose. Sometimes it's not the words you say, but how long you stay silent that tells people who you really are. And Tobias said nothing. He just stood his ground, arms loose at his sides, heart pounding loud as the hoofbeats had been, choosing to be the kind of man who didn't run when the winds turned cruel. This land's taught me plenty, Tobias would later say. But the hardest thing it ever taught me was that doing right often looks like standing still, when everything in you is screaming to run. And in that stillness, Marshal Webb dismounted. He walked forward slowly, boots crunching on the dry earth, pistol low at his side. Behind him, 5 men watched, waiting for a signal. Their eyes said everything. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to finish what someone else had started. And Tobias, he realized he wasn't just in the middle of a manhunt. He was standing between justice and execution. Marshal Dixon Webb wasn't born with power. He earned it, or at least he took it. They said he cleaned up outlaw towns without backup. Said he once shot a man for sneezing during an arrest. And most of all, they said this: when Marshal Webb comes to your door, you'd best not have secrets. But standing there in the evening light, boots planted in Tobias Hartwell's dirt, he wasn't the law. He wasn't justice. He was something else entirely. He was a man hunting a truth too dangerous to let live. Tobias could hear the gravel crunch beneath Webb's steps as he approached. The kind of slow, deliberate pace that wasn't just about getting closer. It was about showing control, making you feel small before a word's even spoken. I'll ask again. Hartwell. Webb said, voice calm as still water. That blood by your well. You really expect me to believe you ain't seen no one today? Behind the marshal, the other deputies watched with still hands and scanning eyes. But something in their posture was changing. Less certain, less loyal. Maybe they were starting to see what Tobias now knew. Too well. Sometimes the man wearing the badge is the most dangerous one in the room. Out here, justice was supposed to be simple. You steal, you get punished. You kill, you hang. You lie, and eventually the truth catches up. But what happens when the man who's supposed to uphold that truth starts using the law to hide his own crimes? That was Webb. He wasn't chasing a criminal. He was covering tracks. And Ayanna, the wounded Apache behind Tobias's well, wasn't the villain. He was the last living witness to something far worse. Tobias stood like a wall between Webb and Ayanna, and in that moment, it hit him. This wasn't just about one man giving another man water. It wasn't about pity or risk. It was about which side of the line he stood on, the side that silenced the truth, or the one that dared to protect it. Tobias had always been raised to respect the badge, but here's what life had taught him. There's a difference between authority and integrity. One is given. The other is earned. And when they don't live in the same man, you've got trouble. Marshal Webb didn't flinch when he made threats. He didn't shout. He didn't even draw. He just kept stepping forward, hand hovering over his pistol, voice low as a warning wind. You're interfering in matters you don't understand, Hartwell. Step aside or you'll hang for harboring a killer. Tobias didn't budge. Behind Webb, the younger deputy, a boy called Bradley, shifted in his saddle. His jaw clenched. His hand brushed his holster, then backed off. You could feel it now in the air. The shift. Like thunder rumbling before a storm. Not just between Webb and Tobias, but among the lawmen themselves. Something wasn't sitting right anymore. Not in their eyes. Not in their gut. Because maybe, just maybe, they were starting to wonder who the outlaw really was. And that's when Ayanna spoke again. Not as a wounded man, not as an Indian, but as a leader. His voice, ragged but steady, carried over the dry wind. Tell them, Marshal. Tell them what you did. Or I will. And just like that, the story cracked open. The mask of law slipped, and what came pouring out was the truth. And that's when Ayanna spoke again. Not as a wounded man, not as an Indian, but as a leader. His voice, ragged but steady, carried over the dry wind. Tell them, Marshal. Tell them what you did. Or I will. And just like that, the story cracked open. The mask of law slipped, and what came pouring out was the truth. We like to tell ourselves that heroes wear guns, that peace comes from strength, that the only way to stop bloodshed is to spill more blood. But sometimes the bravest men aren't the ones with the fastest draw. They're the ones who walk into a room of enemies and offer a seat at the table instead of a bullet. That was Ayanna. He'd risked his life to build peace between the Apache and the settlers. Not with threats, but with trust. He was no ordinary warrior. He was a bridge. And someone had tried to burn that bridge down. Ayanna's voice trembled now, not from weakness, but from memory. 3 days ago, I rode to meet Colonel Morrison, he said. We were to expand the treaty, include the southern lands, but someone else got there first. He looked straight at Marshal Webb. They came dressed like us, painted like us, spoke just enough of our language, and when the smoke cleared, Morrison was dead. And just like that, the whole thing shifted. This wasn't an attack. It was a frame job. Someone had killed Morrison and made it look like the Apache broke the peace. Why? Because peace doesn't profit the powerful. But war, a war does. See, there's the war you fight with bullets and knives. And then there's the kind you fight with lies and silence. This wasn't about territory anymore. It was about money, power, control. Ayanna had found out who'd been selling weapons to the rogue tribes, who had the most to gain if the treaty collapsed, and who had paid good coin to keep men like him quiet. I was supposed to die out there, Ayanna said. But I didn't, because a stranger gave me water, and now the truth has a second chance. Tobias looked around. The deputies weren't just watching anymore. They were listening. To the tone in Ayanna's voice, to the strength behind his words, to the cracks forming in the mask Marshal Webb wore like armor. And Tobias realized something. Sometimes the strongest force in the West wasn't a bullet or a badge. It was a story, told honestly, at the right time. And that story, Ayanna's story, wasn't just saving him. It was waking up the men who'd followed orders without asking why. But if the truth was finally out, then danger wasn't far behind. Because men who profit from war don't take kindly to peace. And the names Ayanna was about to speak weren't just outlaws. They were lawmakers, military men, even marshals. And before the sun went down, every gun on that ranch was about to choose a side. For a long moment, the only sound on the ranch was the creak of saddle leather and the wind in the grass. Then Ayanna spoke again, quieter this time, like the weight of the truth itself had to be carried carefully. Colonel Morrison was murdered. Not by my people, but by men who wore his uniform during the day and sold rifles at night. He reached to his belt and pulled something free, a leather pouch stained with blood. From it, he unfolded a letter, the edges torn and smudged with dust. This, he said, is what they tried to kill me for. The letter had been written the night before Morrison died. In it, the colonel laid out names, dates, payments, all tied to one thing: a secret weapons trade. Rifles meant for army supply had gone missing, and somehow they'd ended up in the hands of renegade bands, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa. Just enough weapons to spark raids, just enough chaos to scare settlers. And every time settlers got scared, land changed hands. Contracts were signed, and someone got rich. Colonel Morrison had started asking the right questions, Ayanna said. And someone made sure he never got to finish asking them. Tobias glanced at Marshal Webb. He wasn't stone-faced anymore. He looked cornered. Deputy Bradley shifted in his saddle. "Marshal," he said, "what about that missing rifle shipment last month? You said it was Indians." Webb turned sharply. "That's enough." But it wasn't. Not anymore. Another deputy, older, quieter, spoke up too. "I saw those same rifles 2 weeks later, in the hands of settlers heading south. Brand new. Government stamp still on them." One by one, the men around Webb started putting the pieces together. And what they saw wasn't pretty, because the truth is, corruption doesn't always look like a villain in the shadows. Sometimes it wears a badge, rides a horse, and tells you it's there to protect you, while digging a grave behind your back. Tobias had grown up believing the law was sacred, that the men who wore the star were cut from better cloth. But standing there, watching Webb sweat under the weight of his own sins, he realized something he wouldn't forget. The badge doesn't make a man right. Truth does. And the truth was standing wounded beside a well. Webb's voice, cracked now, caught between fury and fear. "You fools. You're going to believe him over me? He's a savage, a liar, a murderer." But no one moved. The silence said everything. Ayanna didn't have to shout. He didn't have to plead. Because the truth once spoken out loud doesn't always need repeating. But if Webb was dangerous before, now he was desperate. And desperate men with guns don't go quietly. Just when Tobias thought the worst was over, Ayanna did something no one expected. He began to sing, a low, haunting melody in Apache, the kind that carried farther than words ever could. And somewhere out there beyond the hills, someone was listening. Ayanna was still bleeding when he began to sing. His back rested against the cool stone of the well, his breath shallow. But the sound that came from his lips wasn't weak. It was steady, ancient, a low rhythmic chant in the Apache tongue, like wind slipping between canyon walls. A song older than the fences, older than the laws, older than the men who held the rifles. At first, no one knew what to make of it. Tobias watched in silence. Marshal Webb sneered. "You think singing'll save you?" But Ayanna didn't answer with words. He just kept singing. Out west, every sound meant something. The creak of a saddle, the snap of a twig, the thunder of hooves. But this was a language most white men had never bothered to understand. It wasn't a battle cry. It wasn't a call for mercy. It was something deeper. It was a summons, a signal carried on the evening breeze to those who knew how to listen. Tobias had grown up thinking power was loud, that it came from men who shouted orders, cracked whips, or fired guns into the air. But here was Ayanna, bleeding, cornered, outnumbered, and somehow with nothing but his voice, he changed the air around them. It was like the land itself was listening, and not just the land, because moments later, Tobias felt it. Not heard. Felt. The rumble, far off, familiar, growing, hoofbeats. Marshal Webb's face turned pale. His head snapped toward the horizon. "What is that?" Ayana didn't answer. But the song had stopped, and in that silence they came, over the ridge like ghosts wrapped in dusk. 50 Apache warriors on horseback moving as one. No war cries, no raised weapons, just steady, unstoppable motion. The kind of movement that says, "We've come for our own." At the front rode an elder, silver braided into black hair, eagle feathers at his back, a face carved with decades of sun and battle. He didn't raise his voice, didn't wave a weapon. He simply dismounted and walked toward the wounded man at the well, his son. The other warriors formed a wide circle, not threatening, protective, and for the first time Tobias saw it clearly. This wasn't an army. It was a nation, not scattered tribes or savages, but a people, united, ready, watching. Webb gripped his pistol tight, knuckles bone white. "This changes nothing," he growled. "You're all trespassing on American land." Deputy Bradley raised a hand. "No, Marshal." They were invited. Ayana called, and they came. There was something powerful in that moment. A wounded man called for help, not with a flare or a bullet, but with a song. And his people came. Tobias had never felt smaller or prouder. He stood among strangers. Different skin, different language, different gods. And yet, he felt closer to them than most men he'd shared a table with in town. Because when the wind carried Ayana's song, they answered. That's what makes a nation, Tobias would later say. Not borders, not laws, but people who show up when one of their own calls out. He, Apache, had arrived. The truth had been spoken. The pieces were falling into place. But men like Marshal Webb, they don't surrender. And in the final moments of daylight, Tobias saw it in his eyes. Webb wasn't done. And before the night was over, someone would pull the trigger. The sun had dipped low, brushing the western hills in gold. The long shadows made the circle of Apache warriors look like something sacred. Not a threat, but a shield. A statement. This man is not alone anymore. Tobias stood on one side, Marshal Webb on the other, and between them, truth. Raw, exposed, undeniable. Ayana had revealed the corruption. The deputies had begun to doubt, and the chief, Ayana's father, had arrived to claim his son. But Webb only knew how to fight. Desperation is a funny thing. It doesn't make a man think clearer. It just makes him louder, faster, meaner. Webb's hand twitched at his side where his pistol sat in its holster like a coiled snake. "You fools," he barked. "You're throwing away your futures for what, a dying Indian and a bag of stories." He looked at Tobias with eyes full of venom. "And you brought this on yourself." Tobias didn't flinch. "I gave a man water." But inside he knew. Webb wasn't going to walk away. Men like him didn't retreat. They imploded. Everything happened fast. Webb's hand moved. The pistol came up. Not toward Ayana this time, but toward the chief. A final act of defiance, of rage, of fear masked as control. Ayana, wounded but aware, threw himself between the barrel and his father. But the shot never hit. Because Tobias Hartwell, a rancher, not a soldier, had tackled Webb from behind. The two men hit the dirt-hard dust, rising like smoke from Judgment Day. The pistol clattered out of reach. And when the dust cleared, Webb lay face down, pinned by the man he thought was harmless. Deputies surged forward, disarmed Webb, and bound his hands. Even Hawkins, the last of Webb's loyal men, backed away. His silence a confession of guilt. Ayana groaned, clutching his ribs. The medicine man knelt beside him. And for the first time all day, Tobias exhaled. He looked over and saw the chief watching him. The old man stepped forward, slow, deliberate, and placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders. He didn't speak right away. But when he did, his voice was low and heavy with meaning. Ayana translated, "You are now brother to our people. What you did today, showing mercy to an enemy, standing in the path of hate, choosing truth over fear. These are the actions of a warrior." Tobias didn't know what to say. All his life he'd been told who his enemies were. taught that trust should be earned slowly and given rarely, especially across color, culture, or history. But here, standing in the circle of warriors, he wasn't just accepted, he was honored. "I didn't do it for that," he muttered. "I just couldn't leave him there." And maybe that was the point. Because real brotherhood doesn't come from grand speeches or blood oaths. It comes from simple things: water in a bucket, a shoulder offered, a life risked without expecting thanks. Then came something unexpected. The chief turned, took a wrapped object from one of his warriors, and held it out. It was a war lance, hand-beaded eagle feathers, trailing worn smooth with age. "This belonged to my grandfather," the chief said through Ayanna. "And his grandfather before him. It has never been carried by anyone not born Apache till today." Tobias's hands trembled as he accepted it. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of trust, of peace, of legacy. The sun had set now, casting long ribbons of orange across the plains. The air was still. Webb was shackled. Ayanna was healing. And Tobias, he stood in the middle of it all, no longer just a rancher, but a man who had chosen kindness in a place that had forgotten what kindness looked like. And all it took was a single act of mercy. By the next morning, they were gone. The Apache warriors moved like the wind, silent, purposeful, respectful. They left no tents, no fires, not even a footprint you could track by noon. All they left behind was peace. Ayanna had survived. His wound was serious, but he would recover. The letter from Colonel Morrison was delivered to Fort Richardson, and within weeks, the truth about the arms trade would shake the entire territory. Marshal Webb and his remaining ally Hawkins were taken into custody by their own deputies, tried and convicted. And just like that, the man who once was the law was now a prisoner of it. Tobias stayed behind, still a rancher, still a man who rose at dawn, fed animals, and fixed fence posts. But something in him had shifted. People in town started whispering. Some called him a fool, others called him a traitor. But the people who mattered, they started calling him brother. And it all began with one moment. One simple human act. He gave a dying man water. See, the West didn't need more gunslingers. It didn't need louder men or faster bullets. What it needed, what it still needs, is someone who knows when to set the rifle down. Someone who listens before they shoot. Someone who believes that decency still matters. Tobias Hartwell never ran for office. He never wrote a book, and he never stood on a stage. But he became something far more powerful than any of that, a living reminder that compassion can survive even in a brutal land. We like to tell ourselves that we'd do the right thing, that we'd be brave if the moment came. But the truth, courage doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with doubt, with fear, with no guarantee that anyone will ever know what you did. And yet, you do it anyway. Because that's who you are. Or maybe that's who you want to be. Tobias didn't choose mercy because it was safe. He chose it because it was right. And in doing so, he helped turn a blood-stained frontier into sacred ground. Years later, a boy from town asked him, "Mr. Hartwell, was it worth it?" Tobias looked out at the land, still dry, still hard, still his. He thought about the gunshot, the fear, the weight of every decision that followed. And then he said, "I gave a man water. Sometimes." That's how the world changes. One cup at a time. So if this story found its way to you today, maybe it's because the world still needs reminders like this. Not just about the past, but about the kind of people we can still choose to be. If this story moved you, please take a moment to share it. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if someone bleeding knocked on your door? And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story we tell may just be the one that changes the way you see everything.